Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Podcast. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Boyce. And tonight we're going to be discussing the case for the authenticity of 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. So, Stephen, thank you for joining me tonight.
Yeah, good to be back on, I think, for my second or third time now.
Third
Actually,
time.
I think it's my third time. Yeah, that's right. I was with Jack Bull the other week. Yeah.
And before we continue, I want to let everybody know that Stephen's YouTube channel is tagged in the description below. His YouTube channel is called Facts, so it's tagged as Early Church Facts. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, you can click on the tag and subscribe now. That being said, so I just want to get started with the first question. And as you obviously know, and as many in the audience know, there's a lot of scholars out there. It's not quite the consensus, as you will show tonight, but there's a lot of scholars out there nonetheless that think that Paul did not write 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, and think there's a lot of problems with that. But you're going to show that it's not as problematic as it might appear.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when you listen to the compelling arguments in the modern era of scholars, there are interesting facets that are brought up. One of the things that I've demonstrated multiple times is that when you're looking at this issue, a lot of the work of comparison is on faulty comparisons. Meaning, one of the biggest things for me when I was looking at this subject, because I was intrigued myself, I was willing to change my position. I wasn't stuck or married to a particular position. I was willing to adapt like I did on many of the other discussions on New Testament books. And one of the things I noticed pretty early was that people were actually arguing against it on the basis of syntax, not historical attestation, which I'd be glad to show you multiple historical attestation. I don't think anybody argues the consensus was Paul. No other name was listed to these epistles. But also, in addition to that, the main issue was language, syntax, or unique words. And so the most you get out of that argument is comparisons to works like Romans or Galatians or 1 Corinthians. And one of the things that I noted earlier is that really a fair comparison. Because when you look at Romans, you look at Galatians, you look at Philippians, and these different letters, they're written to entire churches, groups. They're not written to a particular person. Whereas 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus are written to individuals, not as any individual, but beloved individuals by Paul. And so if that were personalized letters written by Paul to these individuals, do we have an authentic letter of Paul that makes more sense to compare with? And that's only really one letter if you take only 7 letters of Paul, and that would be the book of Philemon. So I did a lot of work on that, which we'll get into. But the concerns on the surface are concerns, and they're worth having. And I'm not sad about the idea that we have to wrestle through some of these questions. And there are some good problems that are brought to the table for this being Pauline authorship. But I think if we can work through them, we can find historical attestation and internal reliability to be consistent, and that there's no reason to eliminate him as the author. Now, I do want to clarify something here, Jacob. I do want to clarify the idea. There is a huge difference in my mind between somebody who authorizes a text and someone who writes a text, because the author and the writer can be the same person, but they can also be different people. And to what magnitude that amanuensis is given by the author, meaning he's either writing under strict dictation, which is word for word from what the author is telling him to write. Some are given more free scribal interpretations where they're allowed to be themselves, their personality. I think there's a lot that needs to be led into these discussions too. When I say Pauline authorship, I'm not insinuating necessarily that he was the writer and the author. And I'm not insinuating that he was even just the author who is having a writer under dictation, although that may be the case. But I do think that we need to leave all 3 of those possibilities on the table and say they're not all one and the same. And it can create differences when you're looking at somebody's writer and author in one letter and trying to compare that to another letter where he might not be the writer, but just the author, and he's given the scribe freedom to write in that way. And so those things have to be taken into consideration as well.
So you ready to bring up the slides?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So let me know when it's on full screen.
It is.
All right.
So these are some historical testimonies that I want to kind of mention. Like when we're looking at this from a historical side, 2nd century Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp, a disciple of John. So he's in that Johannine camp, if you would. He's in that Johannine disciples camp that's been passed down. When he thinks of 2 Timothy, specifically, he's focusing on the episcopate of St. Linus. Now, to those who may not know this, St. Linus is the 2nd bishop of Rome after Peter. It is believed that Peter was the first leader of the Church of Rome, along with Paul, and he ordained Linus to succeed him, and after that was Anacletus, and after that was Clement of Rome. So in referencing the episcopate there in Rome, he mentions the figure Linus. And in doing that, he believes this is the same Linus that was mentioned by Paul while in Rome in his letter to Timothy, the 2nd letter. He said, the blessed apostles then, having found and built up on the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in his epistles to Timothy. So he explicitly gives the authority of this letter and the mentioning of the line of 2 Timothy 4:21 and ascribes that to Paul. Later, he also says, and Polycarp himself replied to Marcion, who met with him on one occasion and said, do you know me? I do know you, the firstborn of Satan. What a greeting, by the way. Irenaeus is recalling stories that he had remembered from the teachings of Polycarp. And he is claiming that his mentor ran into Marcion. Now, this becomes important, Jacob, because Marcion is a key figure as it relates to the epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And we'll get into more of that in a minute. But he regards Marcion and Polycarp as having a cross of each other in a conversation. And Polycarp's response is, yeah, I know who you are. You're the firstborn of Satan. Not exactly the nicest greeting in the world, but I mean, he obviously had a major issue with Marcion. He goes on to say, such was the horror which the apostles and their disciples had against holding even verbal communication with any corrupters of the truth. As Paul also says, a man that is a heretic, after the 1st and 2nd admonition, reject knowing that he is such to be subverted in sins, being condemned of himself. Now he's quoting Titus 3:10. So at this point, Irenaeus of Lyons has attributed at least 2 Timothy and Titus to Paul. Not so much that he says Paul writes. It's interesting. He says Paul makes mention and Paul says. So there could be something that or nothing at all. But one thing to regard here is he attributes two of the pastorals to Paul in the 2nd century, including knowing who Marcion was, knowing what Marcion had corrupted and which ones he had not corrupted in the New Testament text. He still attributes him as a heretic as described by Paul in in Titus 3:10. Now, the Muratorian fragment, one of the earlier writings of canon lists, some date it between 170 to 200. We have a good reason to date it around here, specifically with items and people that are mentioned in the actual fragment. In dealing with this under the underlined section on the screen, he goes through the Pauline letters. He says, Paul also wrote out of affection and love, 1 to Philemon, 1 to Titus, 2 to Timothy. And these are held sacred in the esteem of the universal church for the regulation of ecclesiastical discipline. Now, this is really, really important, and I don't want to breeze by this. One of the things he's attributing is a universality and usage of the personalized letters of Paul and disciplinary issues, not just in Rome, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Antioch, but also in North Africa and in the East. He speaks of the universality of the churches who are all holding the authoritative nature of instruction from 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus to the Apostle Paul himself. So this isn't something that we see much debate about. If we were looking at this from a different level, many of the other New Testament books, there are some questions about authorship, like Hebrews, for example, whether or not it was Luke or whether it was Paul or whether it was Apollos. or whether it was Aquila. There's so many theories about who may have wrote the book of Hebrews. There really is no limit or even length of names that is put to these letters outside of Paul himself. And he's saying in this fragment, the writer of this text, that Paul is being held in his instructions as authoritative, not for a singular or a few churches, but all the churches with disciplinary doctrines. Now, one of the things that I underlined here that I think is really, really important to a theory that we're going to look at the very end of this is that when you're talking about the books as a whole, I noticed the Muratorian fragment segregated the generalized epistles to churches versus personal epistles. Note the text again. Out of affection and love, he wrote one to Philemon, one to Titus, two to Timothy. So that means not only is the greeting for these letters different, but the purpose, function, and attitude are different. That's why he says these are done out of affection and love. And so I began to process this as a writer myself. If I'm writing a letter to a generalized group of people that maybe people I work with or people I'm teaching, and I write instructions and things like that in an email, would that look the same way if I wrote a letter to my son or my daughter? Would things change? Would my language change? Would my disposition change? Would the way I talk about things change as it relates to this? And so the Muratorian fragment really gave me the idea to investigate personal letters versus corporate letters, which we'll look at examples in. But notice this. Notice what the Muratorian fragment goes on to tell us. And this is instrumental in understanding the fact that the churches were aware of other writings attributed to Paul that they did not receive. He says, there is current an epistle to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians. Now catch that. The Muratorian fragment recognizes two other letters in circulation attributed to Paul. So if this is an issue of who is receiving and who is not receiving, as pseudo-Pauline, they already knew of pseudo-Pauline letters. He mentions two, and there's many, many more. You have the Acts of Paul. You even have the Apocalypse of Paul. There's numerous writings attributed to Paul in the 2nd and 3rd century that the churches did not receive as Paul. They were disputed as Paul. Note how 2 Timothy, Titus, 1 Timothy are not in the disputed. And the churches knew the ones that were and were not. They were using the ones authoritatively, and the others they were not, like the letter to the Laodiceans or the Alexandrians. It says, both forged in Paul's name to further the heresy of Marcion. So there's a connection here to Marcion's works, his corruptions, the heresy he brought into the church, and that these letters are ascribed to Paul, but not for the benefit of the church, but the benefit of the agenda of Marcion. And he goes on to say, and several others which cannot be received into the universal church, for it is not fitting that gall be mixed with honey. It's interesting the Muratorian fragment points out to us that they know of Pauline letters that have Pauline names and attribution to Paul, but they do not receive them in the universal church. This tells us that no church within the jurisdiction of the apostolic churches and deposits did any one of them ever disregard the pastoral epistles as anything less than Paul's authority to instruct disciplinary actions and to teach us personal relationship and guidance to the next generation out of affection and love. So the Muratorian fragment gives us a lot here. Tertullian does as well, the lawyer in North Africa who came from Rome. He says, in this epistle, Philemon, alone did its brevity avail to protect it against the falsifying hands of Marcion. Here it is again. I find this interesting that Marcion keeps coming up in all three, both really in Irenaeus, Muratorian fragment, and even Tertullian. Now, naturally, Tertullian had a beef with Marcion and had a lot to say about and against Marcion in the work against Marcion. But notice this, he states that 1 Timothy and Titus are not a part of the ones that are corrupted. And he gives a reason why, but it's not the only one. He also doesn't choose to go against the falsifying of Philemon. which brings up the same point I brought up about the Muratorian fragment. Philemon keeps getting lumped in with these other three, which indicates to me that there is a connection and a uniqueness to a personal letter versus corporate. And Marcion here, he says, I wonder, however, when he received this letter, which was written but to one man, that he rejected the two epistles to Timothy and then the one to Titus, which all retreat of ecclesiastical discipline. There it is again, same wording as the Muratorian fragment. His aim was, I suppose, to carry out his interpolating process even to the number of St. Paul's epistles. And so he's giving a hypothesis as to why Marcion neglected to corrupt these, and specifically the same reason that came up from Irenaeus. And that has to do with ecclesiastical disciplines, that has to do with the way it's treated. He gives his reason for this as well. Also, Origen, in his writings on the second, he mentions on the second letter to Timothy, some have dared to reject this epistle, but they were not able to. Did you catch this? Origen is saying that there were people who specifically tried to reject 2 Timothy, but they were not able to do so. Well, why is that? Because of what the Muratorian fragment told us earlier. It had a universal jurisdiction and a universal understanding and authority as given by Paul, while these churches were rejecting all others attributed to Paul. Then he goes on in another writing, say, the reason Origen likely said this was due to Clement writing of Gnosticism in the Stromata, book 2. He goes, this is the statement of Clement of Alexandria. As then, philosophy has been brought into evil repute by pride and self-conceit. So also gnosis, by false gnosis, called by the same name, of which the apostle writing says, already establishes Paul, the same writer as Romans in chapter 6. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and vain babblings and oppositions of knowledge falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. And that's natural. He's quoting 1 Timothy 6:20 through 21. Convicted by this utterance, he's talking about why this may have happened, why it may have been rejected. By its utterance, the heretics reject the epistles to Timothy because it is very straightforward. It calls out their Gnostic tendency. So what he's saying is Paul actually attacked a proto-Gnostic idea that was on the rise. And the Gnostics were not interested in taking in these epistles because it was correcting its philosophical approach based on 1 Timothy 6. Also, Origen, along with Clement, coming together in agreement as to the purpose as to why the Gnostics felt really hindered by these letters rather than could adhere to them and say these are a part of our text. Origen also goes on to say, moreover, Paul, who himself also at the latter time became an apostle of Jesus, says in his epistle to Timothy, this is a faithful saying, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Once again, quoting another one of the pastorals. Last one, Jerome. In his letter 53 says, the apostle Paul writes to Timothy, who had been trained in the holy writings from a child, exhorting him to study them diligently. This is a reference to 2 Timothy 3. Not to neglect the gift which was given to him by the laying on of hands by the presbytery. That's 1 Timothy 4:14. To Titus, he gives commandment that among the bishops, other virtues, which he briefly describes, he should be careful to seek a knowledge of the scriptures. A bishop, he says, must hold fast the faithful word that has been taught, that he may be of sound doctrine, both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. And that's Titus 1:9. Right there, all three, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, are attributed to our letter here. So any time to do some discussion here before we jump into the next section that I want to go over. What you got, Jacob? That was a lot, just kind of going through some attestation, this reasoning, the question about who was behind this. Was it ever rejected? These things are important. Any thoughts on that?
Not at the moment.
Okay. So this is important to me because one of the things that we're looking for is historical attestation. Once more, if someone were to reject Paul in the early church and say this was not Paul, there's plagiarism or there's some sort of thievery of work and corruption and interpolations going on here, we have nothing of the sort. We have universality of consistency about these letters, all attributing them to Paul. Now, again, I want to repeat this to those who may be jumping in now that misses earlier. May I repeat, there is a difference between an author who is the author and writer, an author who has a writer or an amanuensis who is under dictation, and an author who is also using the amanuensis to do free work of scribing. And that could be the case in a lot of ways. But what I want to point out most importantly about this is the two things that I've demonstrated through the Muratorian fragment and also related by something Tertullian said is, are we doing the true comparative work? Now, a lot of people think that 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus are 2nd century corruptions. Now, again, if the patristics have an agenda to keep these, why not go ahead and accept other letters that are attributed to Paul, like the letter to the Laodiceans? We do have remnants and copies of what that letter may have looked like even today. We also have writings ascribed to him that are not rejected by the church. In fact, they're used by the church and held, but not as Paul, but more historical, like the Acts of Paul or the Apocalypse of Paul. Then you have other writings ascribed to him too that even the Muratorian fragment mentioned, like the letter to the Alexandrians. The letter to the Alexandrians gives us reason to believe that there were other letters the churches were not necessarily calling heretical outside of the Muratorian fragment, saying they were attached to Marcion, but not everything in them was heretical. If the letter to the Laodiceans that is referred to by the Muratorian fragment is the same one that we have attestation for today, there's really not anything heretical in it or contradictory to anything else Paul has said in any of his other letters. If it's just a matter of collecting name and giving attestation to letters that were circulating because they wanted to be Paul, we would have found them accept far, far more than just 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. They would have received these other letters attributed to him that are not heretical or partially inaccurate to the cause of Paul, maybe to the cause of somebody else. The churches that were started by the apostles did not dispute this. And that needs to be understood. It is not a disputable section of the Pauline corpus until later. And the only ones that had a problem with it, according to Clement of Alexandria, as well as Origen, is the fact that these things were ascribed against heretics and a pre-Gnostic idea. Now, that brings us into our next point, because one of the things that is ascribed to these letters in modern day scholarship that is understood is the Gnostic idea. Gnosticism really did not take root until the 2nd century, especially with Docetism. But there were earlier forms of Gnosticism that arose out of the 1st century, like Cerinthianism, for example. There were ideas of philosophical perspectives that were creating, even in the days of the apostles, especially the Johannine corpus, Gnostic ideas and formations. It seems like Paul had caught an early, if this is truly Paul, an early rise of Gnostic thinking. And so these crowds already did not obtain and like these letters, as Clement of Alexandria said, for that very purpose. Now, here's something. If these are 2nd century responses to Gnosticism, they are hitting a form of Gnosticism that is not prevalent in other 2nd century Christian writings. For example, much of my work is done in the 2nd century patristics. I'm currently writing another blog, another writing on the Shepherd of Hermas. I just finished, it's about to release just in a few days, a book called 2nd Clement, which is attributed to Clement of Rome, which nobody thinks it is, nor do I. But it is mid-2nd century, and it debunks major Gnostic ideas of its time, and it rises to the occasion to do that. Another letter that does that is in the earlier part of the 1st century, the writings of Ignatius. Ignatius of Antioch, whether you believe he wrote 3 in a short recension or 7 in a middle recension, these letters of Ignatius of Antioch have demonstrated to us that Gnostic rises were even in his mind when combating them. For example, he was talking about their lack of attachment to physical things because all physical matter is evil in Gnostic teachings. And so one of the things that he said was that they deny the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. And the reason they did that is because they believe all physical matter is evil and God would never show, and Christ would never show himself in physical matter. So here's a rejection of Gnosticism in the writings of Ignatius. The 2nd century church fathers were very combative in a simplistic way or in a very complex way at times against these types of teachings. Even later writings like the Johannine letter of First John, whether you believe it's First John or not, most would agree it's much later. I think it's later as well. One of the things that we find from the very first line of that epistle is a knock against Gnostic ideas. And it spends the rest of the chapter in that first section debunking the idea that you cannot sin in the body, which is exactly what Second Clement does as well. And so one of the things that we see is apostolic writings that are facing Gnostic ideas are instantly swinging at these ideas and hitting them right in the center of their core. And that's not what we see in the Pauline letters of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. In fact, we hardly see it at all, just little hints of it. And the form of it is not so much the practice or even the doctrine as much as the idea. Paul is dealing more with the idea in these epistles than the doctrine and the practice, as we see things like John's writings hit, or 2nd Clement, or the writings of Ignatius, or the writings of different, like the letter of Diognetus, for example. There are anti-Gnostic linguistics that are given regularly against these rising teachings. So to form these letters as 2nd century forgeries would fail to do what a 2nd century scribe or a 2nd century author would have done. At that point, they would have gone after the Gnostic teaching, not just in theory, but specifically in function, in practice, and in major doctrine, because 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus are not consistent with the 2nd century patristics we see elsewhere. Or, for that matter, they're not consistent with the other 2nd century forgeries we see attributed to Paul. They do not maintain the character of 2nd century Christianity writings, and therefore I reject the notion that they are a part of 2nd century corpus writings that are attributed to Paul and pseudo, as some have done. Here's a couple of reasons why I add to that. If you want to go back and share my screen, Jacob, I'll put it back on full screen. Tell me when you have it ready. I'm going to give a couple examples of this. I want to give a couple of examples of this. So do we see citations of the pastorals earlier than the 2nd century? We see one before and a couple after. Look at the first one I have on the screen, 1st Clement. I would date it around the year 96. I have friends that want 1st Clement to be much, much earlier. God bless them. I don't think it is. I do think that a good, healthy date for 1st Clement is between 90 and 98. I particularly would place it around 96, 97. It quotes 1 Timothy 1:17. It quotes Titus 3:1. Titus 3:1 being a very important verse. It's already utilizing the language of these texts before a 2nd century forger can come in and create it in the name of Paul. Now, one could argue corruption in the name of Paul in the 2nd century, but we already have two of the pastorals attested by Clement of Rome, if that's who it is, if you believe that or not, whoever he may be. Most people would place 1st Clement at the end of the 1st century, and it is already utilizing two of the three pastoral epistles. Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, which could be dated between 125-35. Somebody could say that it's even later, up to 150. I would roughly leave it around 135 personally. It quotes from all of Timothy's letters and regularly because it's very instructive. 2 Timothy 2:12, 2 Timothy 4:1, 2 Timothy 4:10, 1 Timothy 2:2, 1 Timothy 6:7, 1 Timothy 6:10. So this is already being functionally used. Now, by the way, one thing to point here, as that this is extremely consistent with what we read from the Muratorian fragment, Tertullian, and Irenaeus, that the churches were using these texts for doctrinal disciplines in the universal church. You have Clement coming from Rome. You have Polycarp in the East, both already using the letters as instrumental points to make disciplinary points of emphasis in these churches. Clement is writing to the Corinthians because they are expelling leaders out of their church wrongly. he's giving kind of an admonition in this letter. So this letter is addressing problems and using disciplinary texts like 1 Timothy 1:17, like Titus 3, and the others that you see here for a disciplinary instruction. Same thing with Polycarp to the Philippians. What's going on there? He's giving instruction to the church. He's admonishing them to go back and read Paul's letters, like the one he wrote to them. He mentions that in the letter. And what does he do in instruction? Lots and lots of pastoral discipline. 2 Timothy, 3 times. 1 Timothy, 3 times. And it's a small letter. It's not a big letter. 1 Clement's much bigger than Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians. One of the things that we begin to see immediately here is that it is doing exactly what the Muratorian fragment, Tertullian and Irenaeus said. The universal church and those in them are using this as disciplinary practices. Now, one might argue, but Stephen, the consensus of scholarship states that these do not belong to Paul. So you're out of the consensus. I would argue that if we're looking at the consensus from a certain amount of years, I would agree with you. If we're looking at a consensus from the history of studying these texts, I'm actually in the majority because no one really doubted the authenticity of these until really the 19th century. Now, one of the things that needs to be noted too about the phrase, according to the consensus, I think that is an abused statement. And I think Christians use it wrongly as well. I constantly find myself correcting this even in Christian conversations where people say, well, that's the consensus of scholars on that theology. And they're referring to Christian scholars. Consensus does not equal truth. Consensus just means there's a consistent opinion about something at a certain point with certain thought. That thought is ever changing and consensus is ever changing. We're watching this happen even now. A lot of people have changed their mind about certain writings that they once held opinions about before, or they're going back to earlier attestations that were not accepted before. The consensus is always changing, and so we need to be careful how well we use that as proof for fact. One of the things I want to point is that when you're looking at the British New Testament Conference, this was held a few years back. My friend Elijah Hickson provided this with me. At this conference, you had numerous scholars, over 100 scholars. I'm talking PhDs. I'm talking Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, King's College. We're talking about leading New Testament scholars. You had to have a PhD to be at this conference. One of the discussions was Pauline authorship. So they did a consensus, a survey. It was quite surprising in what they came up with in their votes. So you had about 109 votes per writing of Paul. Really no shock. You find Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, up to Galatians, you have a consistent 109 to 0. You get to Ephesians, there's dispute. 39 believed it was Paul. 42 said, I don't. 28 said, I'm just not sure. Now, that's not so when you're looking at these PhDs that are meeting together in the British New Testament conferences, they're looking at these things that have been labeled consensus. And we have really a first reality of a consensus. People actually voted in an academic arena on what they thought. Now, it is true that the no on Ephesians is in the majority, 42 to 39. But there's also 29 who are not willing to write it off and say it's not Paul, which gives it a greater majority to say it's not, for people to say, well, it's not Paul. There's the consensus, right? Well, the consensus actually does not say that, even on Ephesians. The same thing is true later in Philippians. It's 108 to 1. I want to know who the one was that said no to Philippians. Maybe they got their ballot backward or something. That one is kind of funny to me. Colossians is surprising, very, very surprising to me, because I think this one is important, especially on the language consistency we find in Philemon and Colossians. 56 said that they thought Colossians was authentic to Paul. 17 said no. 36 said they're not sure. What a flip. That was a major flip I was not expecting when I read this. 1 Thessalonians 109 to 0. No shock there, right? 2 Thessalonians then becomes even more intriguing. And Jacob, you and I have had conversations about 2 Thessalonians.
Yeah.
You would think this one would have been flipped quite a bit. 63 said they thought it was Paul. 13 said no. 35 said not sure. The consensus of a bunch of PhDs in the British New Testament Conference. By the way, this isn't a bunch of evangelical conservatives. I just want to keep reasserting that. These are scholars from the major schools around Europe and even some from the United States. These are not straight conservative evangelical scholars. That's not what we're talking about here. First, 2 Timothy. Let's just take a look at these real quick. It looks like a lot. 59 say no to 1 Timothy. 58 say no to 2nd. As opposed to 23 say yes to 1 Timothy. 26 say no to 2 Timothy. But look at the uncertainties. This is what shocked me. 25.
Did you mean to say that 26 said yes to 2 Timothy?
Yes, that's correct. 26 said yes. If I said that wrong, I apologize. Correction. Yes. 26 said yes to it, as opposed to the 58 that said no. But 24, we're not sure. Now, it still leads, even if all 24 were able to be convinced, right, that 2 Timothy belongs. Now you have 50. It's still not in the majority. You would have 58 to 50 if you're looking at this from those who are willing to write it off as Paul. 50 said, I'm not willing to say no to Paul. It might be or it is. That's your two categories. The ones that say, yeah, I don't think it's Paul at all. It's still a majority, but this is not a hauled over major consensus. When people say, well, the majority of scholars today, people think 90-10, 95-5. Here, we don't have a number like that. We have 108 votes. 58 are saying it's not. 50 are saying, yes, it is, or maybe not. We're not sure. We're not willing to say no. We're not willing to say yes. The consensus is a lot more blurred here. Same thing with 1 Timothy. The numbers are almost identical. Titus, 25 say yes. 62 say no. 21 say maybe or not sure. So that's 46 in that category. So there's a lot of struggle here on what to believe. Now, this one's fun. Philemon 108. No one was willing to say no, but one was like, maybe. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So there's that one. And then Hebrews was like 0 yes, 100 no, 9 said uncertain. No shock on that one, right? So if I'm looking at this, Jacob, there's not a like let's get everything history says right here to make Christianity look good at all. 0. Not one single scholar was willing to put Paul's name on Hebrews. Not one. 100 out of 109 votes said not a chance. And 9 were like, maybe not. That is a consensus. That is the majority of scholars. That's what it would look like. Not as blurred as what we just saw in these other letters, especially the pastorals. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that the language of consensus needs to be a lot more careful. And it needs to be a lot more protected in how we say that, because we really need to have data behind it. And who is doing the consensus? Who are we polling? Are we polling a bunch of random Joes? Are these people off the street? Are these people that are in the business world? Are these people in the academic world? What are their degrees? What are their connections? What is their weight of scholarship? Are they book writing? Are they teachers, professors? These things need to be taken into consideration. Like a consensus like this, we know who is there. We know who is a part of this. These are academics with PhDs across Europe and some of the US. Guys who are teaching at Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh. These are major proponents, not of conservative values only in Christian function. So if these people are willing to put some sort of consensus together or some sort of survey, we can actually go off of something like this and say, this gives us an idea of what they at least think in that realm. But to continue to echo and parrot the consensus says, but there is no actual vote of consensus. We're just guessing and assuming that's what the consensus is. And where you are in the world may change in the consensus. And what year you're doing the consensus may change. This is why I say we need to exercise extreme caution when we use the idea of consensus. Now, one of the biggest arguments against 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus is the syntax and vocabulary. I agree completely. One of the things that I pointed out here is the uniqueness of the letters. And I pointed this out earlier, Jacob, when we were on the Muratorian fragment. And I'd actually like to go back to the Muratorian fragment if I can. And I want to pull this back up on the screen. This is what caught my eye, where it's underlined, says Paul also wrote out of affection and love, 1 to Philemon, Titus, 2 to Timothy. And then I noted earlier as well that we see the same thing with Tertullian, where Philemon is once again thrown in the category with these others. So I asked myself, why? Could it be because they're personal letters written out of affection and love, like the Muratorian fragment said? And that would change things. So the comparison of the syntax and vocabulary not being ascribed to Paul anymore is simply on the basis of we're comparing it to books like Romans and Galatians and Philippians and 1 Corinthians. But what if, I said to myself, what if we stopped comparing it to them and took a letter that everyone seems to agree on? Even the consensus there was 108 to 0 to 1 maybe. What if we're comparing it to the wrong things? We maybe, possibly, should start comparing it to a personal letter, since the other three are personal letters, and see if the language is similar. So what I ended up doing, and what you see on the screen here, is the final analysis of me taking the whole book of Philemon. I did this a few years ago, taking the whole book of Philemon, all of its major words, not definite articles, or conjunctions like high and de. I mean, like, okay, everybody uses and but and also. I mean, everybody does that. I mean, there's no need to use those as words. We're talking major words that are functionally in the text and phrases. What I did is I color coordinated these. And in a second, I'm going to take this screen down if we can. And I want to show you the color coordination process. And here's a couple examples. The red bold letters, like you see here on 1:9, 1:10, the red indicates we have a connection to the pastoral language and Philemon. Meaning, my goal in this was, can we take the language and syntax of the pastoral epistles and reconstruct the book of Philemon, which no one really disputes? Because if we could take the syntax of the language of these writings, these three, and reconstruct the book of Philemon, then we actually are comparing the wrong things, and we have cause to believe that Paul may be the author, whether by dictation, whether by a free scribe, or he wrote it himself, which I actually, of all the three, I don't think that's it. I doubt he was the actual writer. But if that's the case, then we need to be careful how quickly we excuse this away from the Pauline corpus and leave it minimally, Jacob, minimally, where a lot of these scholars were willing to go in that survey by saying maybe. My goal in the writing and the research I did here was to take people who are a dead no on the argument of syntax and vocabulary to a maybe. Because I doubt most people will be convinced at this point in their studies, unless they're new to this, going straight to, yeah, I think it's Paul. I think the patristics are right. I think there's something said about that. So red is we have the words in the pastorals. We have connections. Blue is we have no connection. And then I have 8 green. Green are neutral, meaning the root words can be found in both places. So it's kind of like, clearly they know the word, but did they ever use it in this manner? So there were some in that. So when I did the math here, so I subtracted 162 by 14. That brings you to 148. Take away names, right? So proper names. So when you look at the 23 blue, you understand some of those are proper names, like Philemon. Of course, we're not going to find Philemon probably in the pastoral epistles or his wife. So we're going to see uniqueness and things like that. So we start subtracting things in names. So we have about 145 words we're dealing with when it's all said and done that we can legitimately do this. We divide that by the 128. And basically what I came up with is we can reconstruct 88% of the book of Philemon with the pastoral epistles. And I give illustrations of this, like 1:9, old man. Here's some unique words that are only unique to the pastorals and Philemon. See, this was an important test for me too, because a lot of people run to, oh, but there's words in the pastorals that aren't found in anywhere else in Paul's writings. We could do this all day. I could do that with Romans. I can do that with Galatians, and I can do that with Philemon. There are places that are unique to only Philemon that are in Philemon, about 7 to 8 words, depending on if you debate one of them. There's about 7 or 8 words in the little short 1-chapter book of Philemon that are only used in Philemon. We can do that with all these letters. The real question is the connection of, are there words in Philemon that can't be found in 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and Romans, or maybe they're just connected to the pastorals, but not those others? That's the question I wanted to take in. For example, he uses the word old man, presbytos. He uses this in Titus 2:2. He and Titus are the only places Paul refers to older men, not presbyters in the sense of the function of the leader in the churches, but as the aged man. Presbytos is connected in the pastorals and also over here in Philemon, but not in Romans and Galatians and Philippians or 1 Thessalonians. Another word he uses, my child. The singular of this same word for techno, which, by the way, is used a lot in 1 John. If you're familiar with the Johannine writings, he loves the word technos or techno, uses it all the time. But he uses it here in Philemon, but he doesn't refer to that anywhere else in Galatians or Philippians or 1 Thessalonians. But he does use it in 1 Timothy 1:2, 2 Timothy 1:2, Titus 1:4, and he uses technon in 1 Timothy 1:18 and 2 Timothy 2:1. And referring to child. Remember, Jacob, what the Muratorian fragment said. This is the part of the study I did. In the Muratorian fragment, it says, he spoke in these letters, Philemon, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, in love and adoration. These are the terms that are used in love and adoration. Here's a perfect one. Techno and technon. My son. My child, a term of endearment and affection for someone. He doesn't do that in any of the general corporate letters. He only uses this in relation to personal letters. Again, a unique connection. Another one. We see this one was kind of funny to me because Euchreston was used as an adjective, and it's used in the writings of Philemon and in 2 Timothy 2:1 and Eucharistos in 2 Timothy 4:11. It's kind of like a word play is what he does here. And it's the word useless and useful. Useless and useful. He uses both in Philemon. Once he was profitable, or he was unprofitable. Now he is profitable, is how many translations translate this in Philemon. It could be useless, but now he's useful. The useful part is used in the pastorals in 2 Timothy 2 and 2 Timothy 4. Language only unique between these two writings. And Paul even goes on and uses the opposite of it. So these are interesting syntactical things, and I'll pull up the whole list for us if we need to, if you want to take this one down. And before I get to the whole list, is there any thoughts or perspectives there? I thought this was a unique study. I thought it came up with interesting. It doesn't prove anything in the sense of like, well, that's it. Let's all go home, pack it up. Paul wrote them. I don't think studies are going to be that precise. Again, as I stated, Jacob, I think it could lead us to a new category. Instead of saying, yes, it is Paul, no, it's not Paul, to maybe it's Paul. Maybe it is. Or maybe some of it is. Or maybe it's connected to Paul through a later disciple after his life who wanted to honor him. Whatever. Like, we can create more categories, Jacob, than yes and no. Of course, I'm on team yes right now. I was in a team unknown for a while, but we can look at this more than just two ways. There's a lot more to consider here.
I think you make a good point when you link Philemon to the pastorals. You point out that much of Philemon can be reconstructed from them, and it shows that just because it kind of reminds me of those arguments that Second Thessalonians knows First Thessalonians, but it apparently contradicts First Thessalonians.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see how, in some sense, there's some circularity going on. And if Philemon can be largely reconstructed from the pastorals, then it shows that similarities from one letter to the other doesn't prove or disprove anything necessarily, as you were kind of just saying. And they try to make it go one way with letters that they assume are not authentic, to keep them from being authentic.
And that could, and this is where I say, I think the danger, Jacob, is that we've made this so clean cut. Yes, no. Even those who think yes, my objective to them would be, you need to say yes, but you better have better answers than just because somebody in church history said so. Like, there needs to be cause and effect here. Like, we have an attestation, but is the attestation consistent with what the text actually shows? If we could take like I've done the Muratorian fragment, say, look, they categorize these uniquely as personal letters, distinct from the rest of Paul's corpus letters that go to the corporation of the churches. What if we're looking at it wrong and we're looking at the language barrier wrong? This leads us to new categories. Some suggest there are other hands involved that were friends of Paul. Maybe. I'm not saying that's out of this world crazy. Maybe the amanuensis was given a lot more liberty than, say, Galatians. There is a unique part of where Paul says, I wrote this with my own hand, almost insinuating like that wasn't normal or something, that he had to do it to prove a point. And so maybe this, as Paul, especially if these are prison epistles, he's in prison, he has less time and ability to do this. He mentions in 2 Timothy that Luke is with him. If you believe Luke wrote anything, I do. I believe he wrote Luke and Acts. And I also think he is the scribe behind Hebrews. Fun discussion another day. But if the potentiality of other scribes being with Paul had to write this letter for him, they're not going to be able to sit next to him while he's sitting there in prison, Mamertine prison, and go, hey, Paul, give me a dictation, word for word here. We'll dictate it all the way down. Naturally, it would be summaries, like Paul saying something like this. If this is a real life situation, hey, I need you to write a letter. I need you to write one to Timothy, and I need you to write one to Titus. Send the letters and instruct them with these things: A, B, C, D, whatever. You write down these things. And that scribe has freedom. Whoever wrote one wrote all three, in my opinion. Whether it's Paul, Luke, Silas, or somebody else. Somebody who was with Paul or knew Paul or was around Paul wrote these letters. It's still a Pauline letter if he authorized its writing, even in the uniqueness of an amanuensis's own words, vocabulary, and style. And if this is somebody else's vocabulary, words, and style, it seems awfully similar to what Paul did in his writing to Philemon, which may have been a template for somebody like Luke or Silas or somebody writing a letter for Paul to see the endearing state he is writing personal letters to beloved people. Could have been a template, and that's why we have some connections here. But here's the thing. Somebody can write it in their own unique way and follow the outline that Paul had for that letter, and it still be a Pauline letter, but it will look different than his letter to the Galatians or the Romans. These things need to be taken into consideration. I think they should be looked at more serious. I do have the lineup of things to show to your audience, who I'm sure many of them are like, whoa, this guy's wrong. Let me zoom in. I don't know if I'm on. Let's make this. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right. 200% zoom. Sweet. All right. So here's the work I did. I went through verse 1 over here, verse 2 and verse 3 and so forth. And what I did is you see the different color coordinations. As I stated, red is we find these words in the pastorals. This one's easy. Paul, right? Okay, so we see him in Philemon. We see him in all the pastorals. Prisoner. Desmion. Love this idea. He calls himself a desmion in the book of Philemon. It's the same word he uses in 2 Timothy 1:8. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised in any way, shape, or form to see for Christ Jesus. But note this. This is not just for Christ Jesus in the sense of just Jesus, just the word Christ. It's the entire clause. It's together as a genitive noun. And we find that in 1 Timothy 1:1. We find it in 1 Timothy 4:6, 5:21, 2 Timothy 1:2, Titus 1:4, Titus 2:3. And of course, we see Timothy. Timothy's mentioned in Philemon. He's also mentioned, of course, in these others. The ones we wouldn't expect to see is like Philemon. And that's why he's in blue. So we don't expect that. Now we do have the word our beloved, agapeto. So agapeto is beloved. Remember what the Muratorian fragment said. Endearing, loving, and admiration for somebody. Here's one of those terms. Do we see that consistent in the pastorals? Actually, we do. It's the same word Paul uses in 2 Timothy 1:2. We also see a two-word combination here turned into one word, whereas the fellow worker, right? Ergotain. And so you have the fellow worker, and this kind of work, the worker, is emphasized in 2 Timothy 2:15. And then we also see it later, another form of it in 1 Timothy 5:18. So what I did is I went through all of these. So there's 9 major words total in verse 1. We've got 8 red for a total of 27 times. So here's what I did, Jacob. It's not just 8 connections. How many times is that word repeated? 27 times. Just in verse 1 of Philemon, we can find 27 other connections just like it in the pastorals. One blue, obviously, and it's a name, Philemon. Same thing we find in verse 2. Aphia, our sister. So Aphia being the possible wife of Philemon, we wouldn't expect to see her in the pastorals as well. On the other hand, we do see the word sister. See it in 1 Timothy 5:2 in the plural. Archippus, another person, he is mentioned as a fellow soldier. Again, this is 2 terms placed into one. However, the concept of a soldier is used in 2 Timothy 2:3, 2 Timothy 2:4. Very common terminology for 2 Timothy. And then obviously the church. Then he mentions the word house, oikon. So oikon is mentioned as the house church of Philemon, but it's also in 1 Timothy 5:4, 2 Timothy 4:19. Other forms are found in 1 Timothy 3, 1 Timothy 3:15, 2 Timothy 1:16, Titus 1:11. So here, 6 major words are in this verse alone. 4 are connection for 14 total times. 2 are blue, both of which are names, not major words of syntax, names. So as you go through this, I did all the verses. You see this in multiple places. Even looking at koinonia, sharing, the word sharing of your faith. That is one that is not used in the pastoral. So here's an important word that needs to be considered in the 12%. Koinonia is not there. Of your faith obviously is. Tas, pistios. Pistios is used all through the pastorals. 1 Timothy 3, 4, 6. I mean, it's used, different forms. We use it in 2 Timothy 1. But even forms of different verbs may become, right, is used in places like 2 Timothy 2:18. even formations of verbs in the same formation. All through this, I go through every single verb, Jacob, every single one, and go through the uniqueness of these and do the total major numbers. And this is what I showed earlier on the screen at the very bottom. And the green, by the way, are places that they're too close because you have nowhere else used in Paul's letters. But at the same time, they're unique, but they're also root words that may be connected. So obviously the author knew the word, but how they used it in what form. So here's what I had. 2 major words, 2 major phrases. There are 2 red words, 2 red phrases. These total 22. So these are unique. And then you had the whole thing, the whole mathematics that I did, meaning we can reconstruct, when it's all said and done, 88% of Philemon with the language and syntax of the pastoral epistles, which means we should probably not be so quick to excuse them. So you can go ahead and actually, I think, pull those down. But yeah, that's what I got for you. That's what I got for your audience. Just kind of a quick run through of why I think the pastorals do belong to Paul, probably in a way where Paul was telling somebody to write letters for him and make sure these certain things are in them. And somebody did it in a similar way that Paul wrote a personal letter to Philemon. And I think it's too convenient. And I think history and attestation are connected to the internal data, like I showed, which gives us a coherent view and says that there is a possibility and a realistic idea that Paul is behind these letters, or at minimum, somebody who knew Paul or was close to Paul's writings.
Jesus Tales, thank you for that super chat. What does Paul writing the pastorals say about how early the church was organized? Deacons and presbyters. Also, when would you date them?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, because one of the later ideas is the organization. Here's what we do know about the church's organization. Deacons were already around. They were chosen pretty early after the church got big in Jerusalem. So before the church even spread into Antioch, they already had elected deacons in the church of Jerusalem. You can find that in Acts, in the book of Acts. Also, we find in the timeline of Acts that in the church of Jerusalem, as the gospel was spreading, we look at formation of leadership, right? So who gets invited to the Council of Jerusalem, a major council that decides what to do with the issue of circumcision? Do Gentiles who come to faith have to be circumcised like the Jews? They decided no, that was a burden for the Jews. It should not be passed on to the Gentiles. So by that very standard, what you found there were presbyters and oversight from the bishops, if you would. At this time, they're apostles. Here's another keyword. In Acts chapter number 1, when they're looking to exchange the office of apostle that was given to Judas, they replaced it by casting lots between Justus and Matthias. The lots landed at the feet of Matthias. Matthias replaced Judas Iscariot. It's interesting, the word that Peter used in the record of Luke in that section of Acts chapter 1. He makes mention that it is the bishopric that is being replaced. So the apostles are the first overseer. Bishopric is a Latin term. I mean, it simply comes from episkopos, the episcopate, the oversight. That was by the apostles while they were alive. Well, as they're dying off, they're leaving successors like Titus, who's appointing elders in every city, like Timothy, who's in Ephesus. So the terminology is functionally happening while the church is still in Jerusalem and Antioch, and just barely spread into the Jerusalem council. We already have bishops, we already have presbyters, and we already have deacons by the time the church is still subject to closer Palestinian region. So they're already functionally there. We see them operating as authorities in the Council of Jerusalem. Okay, let's just say you don't accept Acts. Fine. Let's take Paul. Paul had understanding of authorities even in the writings of Galatians. Galatians, when he went back to Jerusalem, he appeared to 2 major figures he felt necessary. One was Cephas, or Peter, Petros, rock. He met with him because he was probably the prince of the apostles, which is consistent with, well,
Acts displays Peter, especially in Acts 1, Acts 2, Acts 3. He also makes mention of meeting Jesus's brother, James. Then he mentions that there were 3 pillars in the church of Jerusalem: Peter, James, and John. So there were organizational ranks of leaders already in the church, even in Paul's writings that most people accept, like Galatians. So even if somebody does not accept the book of Acts in its statements, like I do, we still see the consistency of this organizational structure where Paul's addressing presbyters and leaders in all the other letters that people accept, in addition to giving them ranks of authority where some were perceived as pillars, leaders amongst other leaders in the church. Paul also does this in the laying out of leadership in 1 Corinthians as well. So it's no shock or surprise that we would find this even more organizational. So that leads to the second part of the question. How do I date these? I date these right before the death of Paul. I date them in the late 60s. I think that 2 Timothy was probably in the year of his death. 1 Timothy possibly the year before with Titus. And these letters were written while he was in his last imprisonment before his execution. And that would make sense with the structure of development. The apostles were still alive when we see him calling them the pillars. And at this point, people are dying off. James, for example, was killed. Apostles are already being killed. They're now moving on to their successors and leaving strict instructions to their successors. I don't see anything in 1 Timothy and Titus that is inconsistent with the patterns that were done in Jerusalem and Antioch. So I'm fine with the dates on those. I know that people have much later. That's totally fine. If somebody wants to have a later date, if they want to make the argument that they're friends of Paul or later developers and disciples of Paul in the late first century, I really find it problematic to put these in the second century. Very, very problematic for all the reasons I had listed earlier. But hey, I'm not here for everybody to agree with me. That's never going to happen anyway. Somebody asked to share my opinion. That's my opinion. Somebody wants to disagree, feel free to do so.
And for my last question, do you feel that since most of Philemon can be reconstructed from the pastoral epistles, that this shows that the evidence is that the pastorals are authentic? Because you can see that Philemon's language overlaps significantly with the pastorals, which contradicts the argument that the pastorals are so different from the others.
Yeah, I think it proves that we have similar authorship. I think that it proves authenticity to Paul, because the occasion of the letter is more fitting to Philemon than what we see in 1 Corinthians or in Galatians or in Philippians. So when we're looking at these letters, I see enough consistency and uniqueness, especially those that are attached only to the pastorals and Philemon, are typically terms of endearment, like we looked at teknon. These are terms consistent with the Muratorian fragment and what Tertullian was saying. So the occasion, and again, that goes back to the question I asked myself when I was struggling with this. If I'm writing a corporate group an email and I'm sending them a lot of instructions and salutations and things like that, is that email going to look the same if my son is living far away from me and I can't be with them, especially in a situation of chaos, of imprisonment or death? Would I write my son the same way I write that corporate group? And I think anybody that's honest would say no. Nobody's going to write the same way in those two. There's going to be similarities, of course. You are who you are. But the way you present yourself, the wording you're going to use. For example, I'm not going to address a congregation as teknon, my son. Paul calls Timothy and Titus his sons in the faith. He called them sons. So if I was writing to my son, I'm going to use endearing terms like my son, right? So these things have to be taken into consideration. The occasion of the letter, the reason for the letter, the opportunity and the audience of the letter does dictate how we do syntactical comparisons. I think it's a bad comparison to take Galatians, which is instructive criticism to a church that's falling back into Judaism, and compare that to a personal, endearing letter to Timothy and Titus. I think it's a bad idea to take a letter like 1 Corinthians, where Paul is like, you are so divided. You are broken. You're letting sin go undealt with in your church. You're abusing the Lord's table. And he's giving them imperatives, and say that that is comparable to an endearing letter to his sons in the faith as he's giving them instructions in his absence. But Philemon is, because Philemon is a request and a plea on behalf of a brother who he loves and cares about, and now has another son, Onesimus. And he's endearing, and he's using language of pleading with him in a loving way to handle things a certain way. Now that's more comparable. So I think that this, well, the syntax is different argument is too general. There's not enough work done on that. And it's a faulty comparison, in my opinion. This is my opinion. I have good friends that differ with me. I have scholars in the Christian, non-Christian world who are on the opposite side of this, and I respect them. This isn't a pot shot at anybody. This is my personal investigations that I'm sharing, and I'm willing to adapt them as things give me reason to adapt. At this point, I think we've studied the wrong things in this argument. I'm looking for consistency with historical attestation and intrinsic connection. And the intrinsic connection is consistent with Tertullian, Irenaeus, and the Muratorian fragment based on the terminology of endearments and the connection of personal letters being set aside different from the corporate. Even they were doing that in the 2nd century. So maybe that's the starting point, and that's why I did the data points that I did.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick before we close that I have a link. I have Stephen Boyce's YouTube channel tagged in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment as well. Early Church Facts. So you can go over there and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And that being said,
yeah. And by the way, I'm on 7 platforms for our big. We've only been on YouTube for a little bit, not very long. We started out as a podcast doing, Spotify, Podbean, Google Play, all that. We're on 7 other platforms. That's our bigger platform. We're getting slowly building up the YouTube in the last year or so. So we talk about anything. Facts is an acronym. Fathers, Apocrypha, Canon, Text, and Scripture. So anything related to that is the theme. Also speak at a lot of conferences and do debates and things like that. But that's what the channel is. If you don't like watching videos, you can just do the audio on any of your favorite platforms.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me tonight, Stephen Boyce.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.